Good morning. Welcome to the second installment of Journeys of the Soul. Before we start, we're going to be dealing with a pretty heavy subject. So I have to tell the story of this rabbi. He finds a dead mule in the parking lot of a synagogue. So he calls the police, and the police determined that there was no foul play. And they say, go to the health department. The health department assesses the situation, nothing, no danger. Call the sanitation department. He calls the sanitation department, says, yes, we can do it, but you have to have a permit from the mayor. And the rabbi said, oh, the mayor, he's such a tough guy. He's very difficult to deal with. But I have no choice. So he goes to the mayor, and the mayor starts ranting. He said, what are you doing here? What are you bothering me? And isn't that the rabbi's job to bury the dead? And the rabbi says, yes, but it's my custom to notify the next of kin first. Okay, I think that's the extent to the laughing today, because this is a very heavy subject. Let me just review some of the main points we discussed last week. Number one, the awareness of our mortality and the resulting natural fear of death influence many elements of our psyche, behavior, and life choices. Our perspective on death influences multiple areas of our lives. That's important to remember, that anytime we focus on death, it's really our way of trying to understand the value of life. The neshama, which is the soul, is the true essence of the human being, and that is eternal. It precedes the body and continues to exist after the body is no longer here. While still in heaven, it does not desire to descend into a body. The soul does not want to come back down here. And when the time of death arrives, it resumes its native spiritual state. It returns to the state that it was in before you were born. The fact that the briefest spiritual experience of the next world is more pleasurable than all of this world does not diminish the reality that even a brief stay in this world is more important than all of the next. You have this paradox that we discussed last week. On one hand, all the pleasure of this physical world cannot compare to one instant of bliss in the afterlife. And yet, all of the bliss of the eternal life of the soul cannot compare to one instant in good deeds in this world. Therefore, Jewish law gives precedence to preserving life over nearly every mitzvah. Point number 4, this perspective allows us to appreciate and value life without fear of death. That life itself has this intrinsic value, even as we know that death is not the end of life. And finally, while our corporeal needs and endeavors die with the body, our soul-focused aspirations and actions live on eternally. Thus, when we live and identify with eternal values, our current life continues even after the body's demise. So that was more or less what we discussed last week, and we pick up from that point, and we're going to discuss a few questions. Number 1, is death painful for the soul? One would think the soul is going to a world of bliss. It wouldn't be painful. That's a question that we're going to have to discuss. Number 2, does the soul, and this is probably one of the most pressing questions that people ask, does the soul of the deceased retain connection to its body and to its loved ones? Or is it finished? Once the soul is detached from the body, it's detached from the body and from, if it's loved ones, and from the whole existence of this physical world. Is that true, or is there a connection? That's what we're going to discuss. And the third point is, why is burial, as opposed to cremation, important? This is a very sore subject in the Jewish community, and we're going to discuss that, and it's going to be very painful, I think, but it's important to discuss. someone lost a child and was obviously brokenhearted and couldn't find any consolation. And they wrote to the Rebbe, who consoled them in the following way. He asked this person, if you knew that your son traveled to a faraway place, you couldn't communicate, but you know that he's well, he's doing fine, he's happy, he's in a good place. You just can't communicate directly with him. But you could send him gifts. You could send him whatever it is that you value and you think that he would value. Would it make you feel any better? Would you, if you realize that your son is still very much alive in another place, on another plane, in another context, but he is very much alive. And not only that, that person knows what's going on in your life, connects to you, and you could send them gifts. What are those gifts? Every time you do a mitzvah, you give tzedakah, you do another mitzvah, you are sending that soul the gifts that it appreciates and values. Would that help to put things into perspective? Didn't mean to take away the pain. The pain of the loss of a loved one is real, and it's a necessary part of existence. But we also have to look for ways of consoling ourselves, recognizing that death does not mean the end of life. It's not the end, and there are still connections. The question people ask, and you often hear people say, no one ever came back to tell what's going on in the other life. And I'm not going to talk about near-death experiences because that's debated hotly in the scientific community if it's real or it's something going on in your mind. I don't need to deal with near-death experiences to justify the belief that there is a connection and a communication between the souls of our lost ones, of our loved ones who have been deceased, and ourselves. Let me just share what I can tell you dozens of stories that I've heard from people directly who have these experiences. But let me tell you a story that I told many times. What happened with my brother. My brother's wife was traveling in a car from a wedding, and it was terrible weather, and there was an 18-wheeler just collapsed on the car. It killed the driver instantly, who was actually my wife's first cousin and my brother's best friend. And my brother's wife, my sister-in-law, they couldn't find her until a few hours later, until they took her out of the crash site, and she was in a coma for many, many weeks. And thank God she survived, and thank God she's well and alive now. But my brother had an incredible dream. My brother told me in all of his life he never had a dream like this. It was as vivid and as real life. And it says in the Talmud that when you have, most dreams are nonsense. Don't pay any attention to them. Just things that you thought about during the day. It's just your soul's way of cleaning out the debris that it accumulates during the day. Don't attach too much meaning. But if a dream has meaning, it's the dream that you have in the early hours of the morning. Those are the dreams that might likely, or more likely, to be real dreams, more real communication. And in this dream, his best friend comes to him and gives him a message. The next day, he discovers that the brother-in-law of the deceased, who happens to live in Buffalo, had the exact same dream. That his brother-in-law comes to him in the dream with the same message. But there was one addition. In his dream, he asks the deceased, why don't you give this message to your wife, the widow? And he said, I tried. This is what he says in the dream. I tried, but she was too frightened. The next day, he calls the wife and says, did you have a dream? He says, yes, my husband came to me in my dream, and I was too frightened, so I turned away. I couldn't bear to listen to him. 3 people had the same dream about a deceased person coming back with a message. But there are many other stories like this. A woman once came to me and said, do you think I'm crazy? Why would I think you're crazy? Because my mother would come to me in a dream and give me information that I never knew. And is that real, or am I just hallucinating? And I said, no, it's a very real thing. It happens with many people. Why it happens to some and not to others, that's something I can't answer. Sometimes a soul will come back because there's unfinished business and they want the child to take care of it. There could be other reasons as well. But there is definitely communication between souls that have left this world and the people who are still here. Now, we're going to go through a very deep Kabbalistic meditation taken from the Hasidic classic called the Tanya. This is a letter. The part of the Tanya is a collection of letters from the author Rabbi Shneir Zalman, who was the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement. He had a mentor. After his teacher, his real mentor, known as the Maggid of Mizrich, passed away, he left a senior student, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, of Vitebsk. Vitebsk is a city in Belarus. And Rabbi Shneir Zalman was a junior student, so he felt that this Rabbi Menachem Mendel will be his new teacher. But Rabbi Menachem Mendel could not take all the harassment that he was experiencing from the opponents of the Hasidic movement, so he moved to Israel. And he left Rabbi Shneir Zalman to remain as the leader in Belarus and other parts of Europe. And when Rabbi Menachem Mendel passed away, his followers were devastated. And he wrote a letter of consolation. And this is a selection from that letter. And even though the letter was addressed and deals with a tzaddik, the definition of a tzaddik is a righteous person, a completely, totally righteous person whose life is a very spiritual life. And nevertheless, it applies to everyone in a certain way as well. So this is what he writes. This is the translation on page 2. As is known, the life of the tzaddik, the righteous person, is not physical. Yes, he's a physical human being. He breathes and he has blood circulating in his veins. But his life is not about the physical, it's about the spiritual. And it consists of 3 things. Faith, there's a tremendous power of faith that tzaddik has. Reverence for God and love for God. These are the 3 traits that define the soul of a tzaddik. And every one of us has that as well in a measured way, in a minimal way. So it applies to everyone, but it applies mostly to this tzaddik whose whole life is overwhelmed with faith, reverence, and love. Now, during the tzaddik's lifetime on earth, these 3 attributes that belong to the soul dimension of Ruach I'll soon explain, are constrained within their container and garb, namely the nefesh that is bound to the corporeal body. We have a body and we have a soul, but the soul has many levels. We're not going to go into all the levels. There are 5 levels of the soul. But we're only going to discuss the 2 levels that are most important for this discussion. The lowest level of the soul is called nefesh. Sometimes the terms are used interchangeably, but when we talk about them jointly, nefesh is the part of the soul that animates the physical body. It's the part that's responsible for our physical existence. It's the part closest to our body. It's a spiritual entity. It's not physical, but it's the animating force. It's connected to the body more than the other levels of the soul. Then you have Ruach. Ruach has many translations in here. Ruach means wind, it means spirit, but in this context it's referring to the part of the soul that defines our emotional makeup, which is really what defines us mostly as human beings, because most of us are not intellectual beings. Although we have an intellect, most of our lives are expressions of our feelings towards one another, towards everything that's in existence. So the nefesh is the part of the soul that's closest to the body, and the ruach is the part that really defines your emotions, your spiritual makeup. The problem, however, is that when we're when the ruach and the nefesh are contained within the body, the nefesh, which is connected to the body, constrains and limits the ability for the ruach to manifest itself, to express itself. This imposes the restraints of physical space upon these attributes. In other words, the soul of a person, the part of the soul that is more expressive of feelings, of spiritual feelings, can't be fully expressed because it's contained within a body. It's contained within the nefesh, which is contained within the body, and the body imposes certain limits. The physical existence of the person, no matter how holy a person may be, the physical existence imposes limits on your soul. And therefore, your connection to other people's souls have certain limits. No matter how strong you want to be attached to a spiritual person, the fact that you have a body and the spiritual person, regardless of his or her spirituality, is also cloaked within a body, there are limits. As a result, all the tzaddik's disciples receive but a glow of these ruach attributes, a mere ray that is emitted beyond the container by means of the tzaddik's holy words and thoughts. In other words, you want to connect to the tzaddik, and let me just digress for a moment. One of the primary expressions of the Hasidic movement was the focus on connecting your souls with other souls, especially the souls of righteous people. And the connection of a chassid, a follower of a Rabbi, of a Hasidic master, was as profound and even more profound than the connection between a spouse, between a child and a father. It was a very, very powerful emotional experience, and the people who Rabbi Shneir Zalman was writing to felt there was a loss of that connection because of the passing of their teacher. And Rabbi Shneir Zalman is trying to tell them, no, on the contrary, it's going to get stronger now. Because when he was alive, his spiritual essence was covered up by his body, and your body, so your soul was also covered up by your body, and therefore the spiritual connections were not as strong as they can possibly be. Yes, they're there and they're strong through his teachings, but there are still constraints. And therefore, our sages stated that it takes 40 years for students to fully plumb the depths of their master's teachings. In other words, you can have a connection to your master, to the teacher, the spiritual guide and mentor, but you will only get little snippets of that spiritual energy. And it'll take you 40 years to capture the full extent of it. However, by contrast, after the tzaddik's passing, the nefesh separates from the ruach. The nefesh is the part of the soul that's connected to the body, separates from the ruach, which is the more emotional part of the person, and remains in the grave. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. The nefesh stays with the body in the grave even after one's passing, while the ruach and its three attributes rise to Gan Eden. It rises to the Gan Eden is the Garden of Eden, which is another way of saying paradise. Consequently, whoever is close to the tzaddik can receive directly from his ruach in Gan Eden. You don't have to go through any constrained expression of the ruach of the tzaddik because it's not in a body anymore. It doesn't have any limits. And you can receive directly from his ruach in Gan Eden because the ruach is no longer restrained in a container or confined to a physical space. There is now, therefore, a straightforward path for the tzaddik's disciples to connect with the essence of their master's ruach, which is the faith, the awe, and the love with which the tzaddik served God. Not merely these attributes' outer glow that escape beyond their container. In other words, when the tzaddik is alive, the ruach energy has to escape the container, and some of it comes out of the container. You get bits and pieces, snippets of it. He uses the term a ray of it, a little glimmer of light from it, but you don't get the essence of that light. But when the tzaddik passes away, you get the full complement of spiritual energy by attaching yourself and trying to create this connection between you and the tzaddik. These disciples connect and receive commensurate to the degree of their loving connection and closeness to the tzaddik during his lifetime and after his death. In other words, it's not automatic. You have to have had a connection when he was alive. So your soul's connected to the soul of the tzaddik, and now the connection becomes much stronger. And it requires that you make an effort to be connected. It doesn't happen automatically. For the transmission of all things spiritual is always by means of great love. So let's analyze what we just said. We have the nefesh, which is the soul's animating power, and that's connected to the body. The ruach is the soul's emotional, it's not so connected to the body. It's more detached, more spiritual. During life, the ruach is contained in the nefesh, which is connected to the body, and as a result, we cannot fully access the ruach of the other, especially if it is a highly spiritual person. Spiritual people, however, have a much easier time connecting to other souls. And let me give you an example. If you're familiar with the story in the Torah, that Jacob has to run away from his brother's wrath. His brother wanted to kill him, so he runs away, and he meets Rachel, and she's the woman he wants to marry. He's in love with her, and his wily father-in-law tells him, "I'll let you marry her if you work for me for 7 years." And it says in the Torah something very counterintuitive, that 2 days, they'll say it's like 7 years. Because the love is so great, how could you bear to wait? But Jacob says the very opposite. The 7 years were like a few days. No big problem, no big deal. But you're madly in love with her and you can't marry her for 7 years. How could that be? The answer is, marriage is only an external manifestation of a soul relationship, which means that your souls are connected, and it manifests itself physically through marriage. Most people, overwhelmingly, don't have that spiritual connection. They have the physical connection, and hopefully the physical connection could generate more love and more connection, and eventually they will have a spiritual connection as well. But the tzaddik, who's a totally spiritual person, he has the spiritual connection before he has the physical. So he is enjoying the spiritual connection that he had with Rachel even before he had the ability to marry her, and every day was bliss. He was enjoying the paradise of that soul connection to this holy woman, Rachel. So his 7 years was nothing, 7 years of bliss. The physical aspect of his marriage was just the conclusion of that relationship, but the relationship was already there for 7 years, and it got stronger every single day. That's because Jacob's life was not physical. Rachel's life was not physical. These were spiritual people. Yes, they had bodies, they breathed, but they were able to manifest their spiritual character. But nevertheless, even the tzaddik has limits, because his soul is still embodied. It still has a cover that does not allow all of the love, all of the generation of light to shine through. Now, so far we established that your soul is connected to this.
How many passes?
Okay.
How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear? That's what psychologists call unintentional blindness. It's not a condition to be concerned about. In fact, life would be impossible without it. Let me explain. As powerful as the human brain may be, it is easily overwhelmed by the sheer onslaught of observation, calculation, sight, sound, and signals that envelop our every waking hour. The brain cannot permit itself to register and record each image and movement, every message and stimulation. Instead, our brains and nervous systems aggressively filter and limit our intake to manageable levels. The result? We notice a fraction and ignore the fullness and remember far less. Often, we purposely engage in what cognitive neuroscientists call selective attention, like focusing on a dinner partner in a crowded restaurant, while tuning out all other conversations in the room. Now imagine that you have the ability to absorb everything around you, to absorb, comprehend, and recall all the details, and fetch every memory at will, without being overwhelmed. That is the incredible experience of the human soul, once it detaches from the body at the close of a lifetime. Unshackled from the frailties of a nervous system, unrestricted by networks of neurons, unbelievably free, and powerfully present. It is free to absorb truths that mortal minds cannot contain, present to delight in the divine radiance that courses through the cosmos, to bask in divine understanding that supersedes human senses, but is savored by the newly liberated soul.
Okay, that was a good metaphor to understand the difference between the soul in a body and the soul detached from the body. In the body, the soul has certain constraints. It can't experience its full measure of spiritual energy. Once it leaves the body, it can. And to the extent that we focus on the spiritual aspects of our lives, we could connect to those souls. In other words, as you see over here, the deceased ruach, which is the spiritual, emotional energy of the soul, is not interested in mundane things. If you want, let's say the person who died was an avid football fan, was a Buffalo Bills fan, and they won the Super Bowl. And to a Buffalo Bills fan, there's nothing more exciting than that, especially if you're a football devotee. But when the soul leaves this world, sorry to say, this is the bad news. It's totally not interested in football. It will not retain any memory of the Super Bowl, guaranteed. If you want to connect to that soul, when you visit the grave and you say, you know what, the Bills just won another Super Bowl, 2 in a row, wow. That soul is not going to understand what you're talking about. If you say that on the way to the Super Bowl, I saw a poor person and I helped that poor person, that the soul will relate to. That the soul will find exciting. So the more we devote our lives to spiritual matters, which we do by every mitzvah that we perform, that's what connects us to the souls of others. When they're alive, we're connected to one another. Every time a woman, for example, lights a Shabbat candle before the onset of the Sabbath, she is connected to the soul of every other Jewish woman in the world who's doing the same thing. You don't necessarily feel it, but it's there. But it's especially true when the soul of that person is no longer constrained by the body, and you focus on the spiritual connections that you have. So if we have established that the soul, another, yeah, okay.
Welcome to our meditation reflection for Lesson 2 of Journey of the Soul. We're going to try to visualize and relate to the idea of the continuing connection between those who are still inhabiting this world and their loved ones who have moved on. How can we visualize this connection? So I want to share with you a metaphor that was given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe to a grieving family when they lost their dear mother. The Rebbe told the family, you should know that your loved one, when they pass away, hasn't gone to some faraway place. Really, what is the situation? It's as if the whole family is together on the first floor of the house, and this loved one is in the same house with you on the second floor. So we're going to try to visualize. Again, if it helps you to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. If you want to leave your eyes open, leave your eyes open. But start to visualize in your mind's eye a loved one who's passed on. Try to imagine what it was like when you would gather and that person was physically with you. Try to remember the sights, the sounds, the whole setting. And now, imagine that exact same gathering, same setting, and that loved one who's passed on is still there with one difference. They're on the second floor. Take a moment to imagine the feeling. It's hard to describe it, but if we envision it, we may be able to feel it. What does it feel like? The knowledge that this loved one you may not be able to see them, but they're right there, very, very close by, in the same house, where the family is together, everyone is there, and the only difference is they're upstairs, they're on the second floor. Let's try to envision, let's try to visualize a loved one. Try to remember what it was like when they were on the first floor. And now think about the exact same setting. What does it feel like? What does it feel like knowing that they're on the second floor? They're with us. They're with us. They're in the same house. They're only just a few feet away. Not far, far, far away. Very close by. On the second floor. Take a half a minute to visualize and try to connect to this feeling of the loved one on the second floor.
Yes.
So when we talk about chemistry between two people, it means their soul close to each other.
Yeah. When you're talking about, I'm sorry?
It's chemistry, no. When people feel.
The yard side you're talking about?
Huh?
I don't understand. When two people, what two people? What are you talking about?
Sometimes two people meet each other, look at eyes,
Yeah.
and they feel they have
Oh, okay.
feeling to each other. No, In America,
Love at first sight, you're talking about.
chemistry.
Love at first sight.
Chemistry.
What?
Right.
You're saying chemistry.
Right. It could sometimes be a sign that there's a connection, and sometimes it could be just infatuation or something else that's not very.
Nothing to solve.
And it could be. It's hard to know based on physical experiences that there's a connection between two souls. Sometimes you only find out years later that there's a connection.
Putting it right there.
It says that when Isaac married Rebecca, it says he married her and he loved her. Usually it's you love someone, then you marry someone, but sometimes it doesn't work that way. You marry someone because you feel compatible, and then as time progresses, you begin to feel the spiritual connection that you more than you did before, and then it translates in a real passionate love. In our society today, this is another subject, but in our society today, marriages all begin with love, supposedly, and most of them end with hate. A real marriage it begins with like, and it turns into love. But that's another subject, marriage. Now we're talking about the other. Just to add one more little insight, just to understand that when we deal with the connection of our souls to the souls of those departed ones, and we come to those souls with our own measures of what is important and what is appealing, it's not going to make that connection. It's like a little baby. What do you do to connect to the little baby? You give it a rattle. The child gets a little older, the toddler, you give it a toy. Now, if you behave like that to an adult, if you meet an adult and you want to have a relationship, you take out a rattle and you rattle it, the guy's going to think you're crazy. The same thing when the soul leaves this world, it matures. It's a fully matured soul, detached and not encumbered by the body. And in that case, it has much more sophisticated ideas of what's good and what's blissful. And we have to try to bring those ideas to the soul. So especially on a day that we want to connect on a yahrzeit. The yahrzeit is the anniversary of the passing. That's a day when we try to become more spiritual. We study certain parts of Torah. There's the study of the Mishnah. Mishnah is the first part of the Talmud, and the word Mishnah, if you rearrange the letters, it spells neshama, soul, because that's the part of Torah that connects our souls. We give tzedakah. That speaks to the soul. Now, based on what we studied so far, that the soul leaves this world into a blissful state, and it can still connect to us, you would think that the soul doesn't feel any pain when it leaves the body. And here is the paradox. Nothing, it says in the Zohar, which is the principal work of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, nothing is as hard for the soul as its separation from the body. Why? Why is the soul so upset when it has to leave the body, when the soul is going to be unfettered now? It's going to have unlimited experiences, the most blissful experiences. Why should it be in any way pained by that? So number one, transitions are difficult. We all know that in our own lives. You can have a job and you get an offer for a much better job, but it requires a transition. You have to move to another place. It's new employers, new employees. It's sometimes frightening. It's a new situation. That's a human condition. That transition is not easy. The soul is making a transition from one state of existence to another. It could be painful for the soul. But even more than that, only in this world can a soul do a mitzvah. Once the soul is detached from the body, the soul cannot give tzedakah, can't give charity. Souls don't have money. They can't help an old lady cross the street, the proverbial act of kindness. because there's no old ladies that need to cross the street, no streets. I mean, all the images of good deeds, of mitzvahs, it can't put on tefillin, it can't light a Shabbos candle, it can't do any of those things. It has no struggle, it has no challenge, it has no ability to do all these mitzvahs that it had when it was still alive. And that's why the greatest and most holy of people wanted to live another day, even in one more day. Why one more day? Why don't you go to your eternal reward sooner? No, because one more day means they had one more day they can do another mitzvah. That's the reason they had, when they gave, why they prayed for another day to live. A third reason, and deeper one, is, and this is where Judaism is probably unique, that the soul craves to be with the body, because the body has something that is very special. Because, number one, the whole life of a person lives to the age of 120. What did the person accomplish? The person accomplished whatever he or she accomplished only because they had a body. The soul could not have accomplished all this. So the body enabled the soul to fulfill its mission. The soul interacted with the body. It lived with the body. It was married to the body for all those years of life. And separation is traumatic. It's like a teacher. You're teaching elementary school, teaching the 8th grade, and you have wonderful students. You're a good teacher, and you become very attached to the students. And the students are now graduating into high school. They're going to be in a different building. You won't see them anymore. The teacher would rather have them forever. But the teacher knows that, no, we can't have them forever, but it's still hard. The teacher wants the student to graduate, but the teacher finds it hard to part with those students that it had interaction with. The Kabbalists go a step further, and they say that the body has a higher spiritual source than the soul. It's just that the body doesn't know it, and the body has no way of experiencing its own essence, its own spiritual essence. The soul is the teacher. You have a school. School has administrators, it has teachers, it has students, it has maintenance, it has psychologists, it has a whole bunch of people working in that school. For whom is the school? For the administrators, to employ administrators? In some colleges, I think there are more administrators than there are students. But that's not really what the school is for administrators. It's not for the maintenance. It's not even for the teachers. It's for the students. So the goal of life is for the body to be transformed. And the only one who can do it is the teacher, the soul. The soul is the teacher. The soul, the teacher, doesn't want to be separated from its student. Because, number one, that was its whole mission, and that's its whole raison d'etre. That's why the soul is here in this world, to educate and edify and refine the body. But also it recognizes that the body has something. Sometimes the teacher, Einstein's teacher, I don't know if he ever realized who a student was, but Einstein's teacher was a teacher of Einstein. Einstein didn't know anything before he went to school. So the teacher could say, look, I'm superior to Einstein in terms of knowledge. No, he wasn't. And if the teacher had any brains, the teacher would be glowing with pride that this is his student. And the soul glows with pride. Look at the body that I educated. Look how I changed this body from a piece of flesh to a living, vibrant messenger of goodness in this world. So the soul doesn't want to leave the body. And the soul is also mourning its passing, in spite of the fact that the soul is now going to enjoy something more sophisticated, more enlightened than ever before. And here we have different texts that go through the way the soul leaves the body. The soul does not leave the body the same way or in one shot. It's a moment of death, a moment before the soul was in the body, a moment later the soul has left the body. It doesn't work that way. Actually, I don't have the text over here, but there are some sources that say that many people, weeks before their passing, sense that they're going to leave this world. You hear stories of people telling their loved ones, bidding them farewell, or telling them things that you only would tell someone when you know that you're not going to be seeing them again. They sensed it. There was a certain premonition that they had, and it's real. Not everyone has it, but it is something that is real. The soul is preparing for the journey. It's packing its bags for the journey. But after the soul leaves the body, the Jerusalem Talmud says, for 3 days, the soul hovers above the body, thinking that it can return to it. After 3 days, when it sees that the body's face has changed, it leaves the body and departs. Now, what about if the body's face doesn't change? It doesn't mean literally that the body's face has to totally change, but there's something that happens in 3 days that the soul realizes its destiny is not to be with that body anymore. At least not, we do believe, and we'll talk about that in the last class, about the idea of the resurrection of the dead, but that's something else. Then, in the Zohar, which is the work of mysticism, it talks about 7 days. For 7 days, the soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave, and from the grave back to the house, and it mourns its body. After 7 days, the body is subjected to its fate. It starts the process of decomposition, and the soul ascends to its place. Does anyone know what the word Shiva means? What?
I have a question to ask you.
Yeah.
When somebody is nifted, okay, I was thinking to myself that the neshama doesn't, in fact, you just reinforced what I was thinking, doesn't leave the body right away. Now, at a Jewish funeral, when the casket comes out and we walk towards the grave site, we take it slow. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Is this one of the reasons we take it? Is this one of the reasons? I know one of the other reasons is the family's not in a hurry to bury their loved one.
Mm-hmm.
Is this also a reason so it gives the neshama a chance?
I never heard that, but it could be.
I'm wondering if there's a connection there. because
I'm not going
sounds like,
to discount that, but I didn't hear that.
right, but we take it slow and we don't
because-
rush it. And this way it gives the neshama a
Right.
chance to say its goodbye to the guf.
That could be, but there is, as we see over here, there is a process. Now, Shiva, as you said, means 7. I once heard someone say they're only going to observe 1 or 2 or 3 days. It says, because who says Shiva has to be 7 days? Well, if it's not 7 days, don't call it Shiva. Shiva means 7. Shiva has no other meaning other than 7. So it's a 7-day period. It could be shortened if there's a holiday in the middle. Let's say if a person passes away the day before Passover, and they sat Shiva just for an hour, or even less. That's it. There's no more Shiva, because the holiday takes away the Shiva. So, but that's an exception to the general rule of 7 days. And even though it's 7 days, it's not 7 full days. If the person is buried, let's say Sunday before sunset, which is, let's say 5 o'clock today on last Sunday, because I don't want to talk about people dying anymore. Last Sunday, someone passed away at 5 p.m. before sunset. That was day 1. The day 7, only the beginning of the day has to be counted. So it could be less than 7 days. It's not 7 times 24 hours. That's what I want to say. So the soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave. And that's why it says that it's preferable to sit Shiva, as it's called, in the house of the deceased. It's not always possible. It's not a law requirement, but it's considered preferable that the Shiva should be in the house of the person who passed away, because that's where the soul visits during that 7-day period. So you have a closer connection to the soul. Then it goes on in the Zohar, in another part of the Zohar. For 30 days, the soul and the body are judged as one. And thus the soul is located down here on earth, because God looks at the total human being, the soul and body, and judges them jointly. After that, the soul ascends while the body erodes here in the earth. In spite of that, it says that the nefesh still remains, or a part of the nefesh still remains with the soul, even after the 30 days, even after the year. which is the next period. For 12 months, the Talmud says, the body still exists. And this, in other words, the decomposition isn't total, which is, of course, a generalization. And the soul ascends and descends. After 12 months, the body becomes null, means it deteriorates, and the soul rises and no longer returns. And again, as I said before, it doesn't mean the soul is not connected. There's always a vestige of that connection. And just like the entry of the soul into the body is in stages, what we see over here, so too the departure of the soul is also in stages. But in all these stages, there's an aspect of the soul that remains connected to the place of burial. That's why Jewish tradition is that we go visit graves. It's not just a way of reflecting on the life of the person that we loved, but you're actually connecting because their soul is always connected to that place. So it's customary on the yard site, wherever possible, to go visit the grave site on the anniversary of that person's passing. Now, just like there's a few stages, generally 3 stages in the soul leaving the body, the 3 days, the 7 days, actually more than 3, the 3, 7, 30, and 12 months, 4 different stages, and plus the time of death itself, which is 5. There's also different stages of mourning. Here's a statement from Maimonides, which is based on the Talmud. Mourners observe 3 days of weeping. In other words, the first 3 days are the more intense period of sadness, which is not only legitimate but desirable that people should feel sad. Although you see in contemporary settings, people try to ignore their sadness and try to, and even at the funerals, to laugh, to tell humorous things. I can't knock it entirely because you're dealing with people's emotions and you have to be very careful and respectful to their emotions at a time like this. But there's nothing wrong with confronting grief, nothing wrong with expressing sadness. It has to be measured, it has to be progressive, or what's the opposite of progressive? Regressive, I guess. You can't keep up the same degree of mourning, of grief, of weeping forever. That's not healthy, and it's not consistent with Jewish beliefs that, yes, it's a sad event, but there's always a compensating aspect of it, that the soul is now liberated and the soul can now climb to higher levels. So what happens in these 3 days of weeping is followed by 7 days of eulogies. Doesn't mean you can't give a eulogy before that. It means then you focus more about the life of that person, which I see absent in Shiva houses, which is sad, I think, because most people, when they come to the Shiva house, I have to admit as well, we all feel very uncomfortable. We don't know how to relate to the person who just lost a loved one. It's hard to know what to say and what to do. But one thing is for sure, that it's a very desirable thing to focus on the life of the person who passed away. Talk about the things that person did that were special. Talk about their love. Talk about their kindness. Talk about their wisdom. Talk about whatever virtue, and everyone has virtue. Although, to be a little bit on the humorous side, there was a rabbi who had a problem because the person who died was known as a terrible person, horrible person, didn't have one redeeming quality, really just a terrible, despicable individual. And the rabbi had to give a eulogy. What is the rabbi going to say? So he gets up and he says, you know this man who just passed away? His brother was much worse. So, my father, who officiated a lot of funerals, sadly, as a rabbi for 40 years, once he told me he once had a person whose brother was not as bad as he was. So he couldn't even say that. So he had to focus on his soul, that the soul is pure and the soul is now in a better place. He couldn't find anything good to say. It's rare. It was one out of maybe 2,000 funerals that he officiated at. At any rate, so what happens after the 7 days of eulogies? For 30 days there are restrictions on haircuts and wearing freshly ironed clothing, marrying, you can't get married then, joining a celebration of friends, and traveling on business, unless it's absolutely necessary for your livelihood. Why are there these restrictions? Well, the simple reason is that these restrictions help to keep your mind focused on what you just lost. Don't go back to normal life right away, because it's not normal. Death is not what some people say, well, it's part of life. Yes, it is, unfortunately, part of living, but the focus has to be on it's not normal. We celebrate life, and don't go back to being normal, at least for 30 days. I think there's another deeper reason, that just like in order to feel the pain of the loss, we also have to de-emphasize the physical and aesthetic needs of the human being. That way we feel the loss, because we are experiencing loss in our own lives. We feel uncomfortable about not being able to wear freshly ironed clothing. We're not comfortable that we can't come to a celebration of friends. So that's a way of empathizing and identifying with the mourners who are in a state of grief. Now, here we come to a very powerful concept, that mourning is not only for the deceased, it's not only for the deceased, but it's with the deceased, that the soul is also mourning. And when we mourn, we're mourning with the soul of the deceased. And it's based on a passage in the Talmud. If a person dies and leaves no next of kin to be comforted, no relatives, a stranger comes to town and dies, he has no relatives, no one who is really going to be sitting shiva. No one is going to be mourning or comforted. So what do you do? What do you do? What do you do if the person didn't die? I mean, you don't do anything. I mean, the person doesn't have the ability to be, there's no need to comfort anyone, you would think. So the Talmud says, no. 10 people who represent the community should go and sit in the deceased home. They said Shiva. 10 total strangers. A man, and the Talmud tells a story. A man died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighborhood. As there were no mourners to be comforted, Rabbi Yehuda assembled 10 people every day, and they sat in the deceased home. After 7 days, the dead man appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and said, "May your mind be at rest, for you have set my mind at rest. You comforted me." The deceased is also being comforted when we comfort the mourners, because the soul is also mourning its departure from this world. Now, what is it? It's based, and it's interesting, one of the commentaries known as the Maharsha says, it's interesting that it doesn't say there were no mourners, but no comforters. Because there is a mourner, the soul is the mourner. But there's no one to comfort because there were no relatives, so you have to take 10 people who represent the community. One professor was giving a talk on this passage of Maimonides. I think he was here in Buffalo. I forgot his name. He was here a few years ago. So he mentioned that the fact that Maimonides includes the laws of mourning in a book devoted to government, the laws of the Sanhedrin, the laws of kings, the laws relating to the community. So why is mourning related to the community? It should be in another section where it talks about the laws of individuals, of families. So his argument was that Maimonides, based on the Talmud, considers the process of mourning to be a communal thing. The community mourns. And sometimes it's literal when you take 10 people from the community. So when you come to the Shiva house, it's part of a communal exercise. And I found that what he said was accurate. That the comforting of the mourners is not just an individual thing, a familial thing, a thing of friends, but it's part of Jewish people living in one community where we care about one another. And not only do we care about those who are alive, we even care about those who have passed away.
I have a question to ask you. On page 6, it says the 12 months the body still exists and soul in descent. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, correct me if I'm mistaken, when we do Shiva, when we do Kaddish, we only say it for 11 months, we don't say it for 12 months.
Right.
I forget there was a reason why.
Yes, there is a reason. The reason is, and we'll probably talk more about it in one of the next classes, the reason is that the soul goes through a purification process for 12, the maximum would be 12 months.
Right.
To sit Shiva for a parent, and I'm saying to say Kaddish for 12 months, would mean that you implied that your father or mother needed the maximum, which is not respectful. So we leave out 1 month. And since it was that way for a parent, it was extended to every relative that you say Kaddish for. Although Sephardic Jews, I think, only do 1 week at the end.
They only do what, 1 week?
I believe so. We'll talk more about it when we get to that subject of the afterlife and the idea of heaven and hell. Maimonides mentions this other law. It appears to me, Maimonides wrote a code of law consisting of 1,000 chapters. It's one of the most comprehensive books of Jewish law. And 99% of the text, he bases it on the Talmud. And he doesn't put in his own views, although the way he interprets the Talmud is all his own. But there are about a handful of places where he says, this is my opinion. This is one of them. He says, it appears to me that comforting mourners takes precedence over visiting the ill. If you have, let's say, you're going to go to two people. One is to comfort a mourner. One is to visit someone who's ill. First, go to the mourner. Why? And his logic is because comforting mourners constitutes an act of kindness to both the living and the departed. Whereas visiting the sick is only for the living. In other words, when you comfort a mourner, it's a double kindness. Kindness to the mourners and kindness to the soul of the departed one. Because the soul is also in a state of mourning. And now we get to the funeral, which involves the burial of the body. What is the Hebrew word for funeral? Levaya. Levaya means escorting. Escorting someone is the biggest sign of respect and care. The laws of hospitality, Maimonides devotes several laws concerning the Jewish requirement of hospitality. Hospitality primarily refers to someone who's traveling through town, who's coming from another place, doesn't have his own place to stay. You invite him to your home, you feed him, you give him to drink, give him a place to sleep. And Maimonides says the most important part of hospitality is escorting them on their way, giving them an escort, which one way of understanding that is that's the sign that you're not just trying to fill in a void. Person is hungry, a starving person, who would not give a starving person a sandwich? But it's much more than that. You're showing them that you're escorting them, you're taking them on their way. Besides the fact that it helps to protect them while they're traveling, there's an expression of care for that person, empathy for that person. Well, the same word that's used for escorting a guest in hospitality is used for a funeral. You're escorting the person to another place. And it's a sign of respect, which we're required to give the soul of the departed one. And as I said before, the body, not only the soul, is respected. And that's why Judaism has many laws against mutilating the body. The Talmud tells us, and Maimonides codifies this, if I have $100 and I don't care about it, I just throw it out, anyone can take it. I have every right to do that. I could tell you, you can go in my bank account and take out whatever you want. We can do that because my money is mine. God gave it to me and I have ownership over it. But if I tell you, punch me in the nose, I give you full permission, you're not allowed to do that. Because you can't give permission to mutilate your body because the body is not given to us. We do not own our own bodies. They're leased to us. Our money is given to us as a gift. To utilize our money and our possessions are given to us as a gift that we should utilize to the best of our ability to do good, to support ourselves, of course. But the body is on lease, and we can't do anything to mutilate the body. You can't injure the body or tell someone else, you can injure my body, I don't care. Unless it's a surgeon who's injuring the body in order to save someone's life or to make someone's health better. That's a different story. That you have permission to do. But to let someone just wantonly punch you or harm you physically, you're not allowed to do that. And that's one of the reasons why the Torah prohibits tattoos. Now, I know that there's a craze in the last decade or so of people getting tattoos, which I can't understand logically why they would do that. But tattoos is an express commandment in the Torah. Now, there is a myth that you can't bury a Jew who has a tattoo in a Jewish cemetery. That's not true. You can bury a Jew in a cemetery even if the Jew violates every law in the Torah. It is true that there are certain communities who used to have certain restrictions that only people who were part of their community and followed community standards to be buried in that cemetery. In other words, if a person violated certain laws of the Torah, any law of the Torah, that community could have a standard not to bury them in that cemetery. They'd have to look for another place. So the same thing would apply to tattoos. So theoretically, a person with tattoos is not considered to be not Jewish anymore, but it still is forbidden. The Torah absolutely forbids it. And one of the reasons for it, there are many reasons. One reason is that was a custom of the pagans to tattoo their bodies as a way of submission to their pagan god. But another reason is because the body is holy, the body is sacred, the body doesn't belong to us, and we have no right to in any way mutilate it.
What is the halacha on suicide?
What do you mean, what is the halacha?
Are they permitted, if somebody's Jewish and they committed suicide, are they permitted to be buried according to halacha?
Okay, suicide is a little complicated because 99.9% of people who commit suicide, or the modern way of referring to who died by suicide, do it because they don't know that it's wrong, and there's a certain mental condition that is involved. People in their right mind do not commit suicide. That's a premise in Judaism. So even though theoretically suicide is considered worse than murder, why? Because one of the commentaries says because murder could be atoned for by your own death. It's a little bit of an atonement. You can't atone for suicide by your own death because that's the crime. The crime can't be the atonement. That's one rationale for it. But I have never heard of a case in all my life. I've heard of hundreds of people who did die through suicide that they were denied a burial in a Jewish cemetery.
Okay, that was my question.
The only person I would say would be subjected to that rule would be a intellectual who came to the conclusion that life should only, there's I think a professor at UB who said only until 75. After 75, everyone should be euthanized, except for him probably.
Except
he changed his mind. He was close to 75, I think, when he changed his mind. I don't remember the name, but a person like that, who intellectually, who's totally normal in every respect, he's a respected academic, and he devises a philosophy of taking your own life, and not someone who's in terrible pain and can't tolerate the suffering. That's a different story. But that's the answer to that question. But anyhow, the Talmud makes a very stunning comparison. It says, one who was present at the time of a person's passing is required to tear their clothing, which is what we do. The mourners have to rend their garments at the funeral. But actually, the law is that if you're there at the time of the passing, that's when you have to rip your garments. That's not the custom today. And one of the reasons for that is it's a desirable thing to have people present at the passing of a person, that the person should not die alone. It's not always possible, and you're not a sinner if you weren't there. But wherever it's possible, even to have a minion present. I know when my father passed away, we were able to, it was predictable. We knew he was at the end of life, the last few moments. We had a minion present that said Shema Yisrael at the moment of his passing. That was considered to be a great privilege because not everyone could do that. It's not possible for most people. 99% of people can't do that. It's just not feasible. It didn't happen when my mother passed away, so it's not a judgment on anyone. But because it is a desirable thing to have people present, the person shouldn't die alone. If you'd have to rip your garments every time you were at the passing of a person, or if you're a doctor, you wouldn't have any clothing left. So the rule was relaxed that you do the ripping at the time of the funeral. But anyhow, the Talmud says that why do they have to tear their clothing? They're not even related. This is because a person's passing is likened to the burning of a Torah scroll. If, God forbid, a Torah scroll is burnt, it's a time of mourning, because it's the holiest object that we have. And here's from a 20th century authority on Jewish law, who wrote a classic book on the laws of death and mourning. He writes as follows: all who tend to a corpse must be aware that they are handling a holy entity. The human body is more than simply a sheath to a sacred entity. It's not just a sheath, a cover, a tool that serves a supernal soul, like the ark, which houses the Torah scroll. It's a holy object because it houses a Torah scroll. It's more than that. It's not simply that. Rather, it has itself become sanctified with an independent holiness similar to a Torah scroll. How did it become sanctified? How? Because it did a mitzvah. It did mitzvahs. So someone will say, but what about Jews who never do mitzvahs? Well, the Talmud responds to that and says that Jewish people, it says in the book of Song of Songs, are compared to a pomegranate. We're compared to fruits and nuts, by the way. But we are compared to fruits and nuts. That is true. We're compared to many different fruits, and one of the we're compared to dates. We're compared to figs. We're compared to a lot of different fruits. But one of the fruits we're compared to is a pomegranate, which is one of the beloved fruits of Israel. So the Talmud says, just like a pomegranate is filled with seeds, even the sinners of Israel are filled with mitzvahs like a pomegranate. You can't avoid doing a mitzvah. Anytime you do some act of kindness, anytime you do the most minimal act and gesture, it's another mitzvah, and therefore it changes your body. Your body has become very special, very holy. So the human being is like a Torah scroll. Maimonides, who was a 13th century rabbi, considered probably the greatest rabbi of his time. He points, not Maimonides, that's half a century before Nachmanides, who likewise was considered to be the greatest rabbi of his time by many. Nachmanides points to the sacred names of God that are inked onto a Torah scroll's parchment as an analogy for the sacred soul that is installed within the corporeal body. A Torah scroll has text, and in the text it has God's name, and it also has the parchment itself. They're all holy. But what makes the parchment holy? Parchment in and of itself is not holy. What makes it holy is the ink in which we wrote God's name. And that's what makes the whole Torah scroll holy. The same thing is true with the soul and the body, that it's the soul that inhabits the body that makes the body holy. And who are the people who do the burial? Throughout Jewish history, the people who do the burial, it was a communal thing. It was not a business as it is today. And actually I think in England, Australia, there is no such thing as private Jewish funeral homes. It's a community funeral home. And there's a fixed fee that you pay to help defray their costs, and there's no profit involved, which is the way, ideally, that's the way it should be. It shouldn't be a business. Burial shouldn't cost $10,000, $15,000. I'm not begrudging funeral directors to make that money. They have to make a living, and this is the way it is in America, but that's not the ideal. The ideal is it's a communal thing. The community buries its dead, and the people who were directly involved were called Chevra Kadisha. What does Chevra Kadisha mean? The Holy Society. They're not called just the Burial Society, they're called the Holy Society. And you have to treat the body, even though it's a dead body, it's a corpse, with care and dignity. No casual conversation allowed in the presence of the deceased. And the deceased is always covered. And the Jewish tradition is the deceased is given a tahara. Tahara means purification. It's washed in a special way. It's dressed with special shrouds, very simple linen shrouds, and placed in a pine box, a very simple, cheap pine box. What's the reason for that? Well, the Talmud tells us that one of the Jewish, I think it's Rabbi Gamliel, if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi Gamliel was the Nasi, the leader of the Jewish people, and extremely wealthy. And he banned burying people in expensive shrouds, in expensive coffins. Why? Because he said poor people were embarrassed to bury their dead because they couldn't afford all these extravagant trimmings and accoutrements that went along with the burial. So what did they do? They kept their dead loved ones in their homes. You can imagine how horrible their lives were when they did that. So Rabbi Gamliel, I think it was Rabbi Gamliel, made a law that said that nobody could bury their dead in a more opulent way than the poorest of people. So they used the simplest pine box, the simplest shrouds. I think there's a... What? You have something to show? No, okay, the time is, we're going way beyond our normal time. Okay, does everyone want to continue?
Yes.
Okay. If you don't want to continue, just take some tomato and throw it at me. That'll be my signal. We never place the deceased face down. The body should never be left alone, and we need a shomer, a guard, an honor guard. Unfortunately, it's not always feasible, and the reason for that is because we're in Buffalo, because we're living in a small community, and to guard the body means if the person died on a Sunday and the funeral is Tuesday, that means for 48 hours plus, you need someone to be there all the time, throughout the whole night. How many people could stay up all night and just stand there and sit there watching a body? Okay, we recite Psalms. People do it. So in New York and other large communities, you have people who do this, and they don't let the body alone for even 1 minute. Some people in Buffalo are fortunate enough that they can get people to do it, which is another reason why funerals should not be delayed. According to Jewish law, the Torah commands us to bury the dead the day they pass away. Unless there's an overriding reason, let's say the children can't come in time. They live in Los Angeles and they have to come to Buffalo to take them time to get a flight, and by the time they're here, it's another day, another 2 days. But just for the sake, let's say you want to have it on Sunday so more people could come, that's not a justification. But yes?
What about if the body is going to be moved to, let's say, New York City and buried in a cemetery in New York City?
Oh, that's different.
How
That's
does
different.
that work?
Oh, no, if the body has to be buried in a family plot, let's say, in another city, or even taken to Israel, then whatever it takes. But no wanton delay, no frivolous delay. It has to be done as soon as possible, because it's more... The soul feels more comfortable when the process is done with dispatch. I just want to conclude. We'll have to maybe go back to this in the next class, but I wanted to spend more time on it. But I know it's going to be painful to some people because of what happened to them in their own lives. But Judaism is 100% unequivocally opposed to cremation. It's considered to be a very, very serious breach of Jewish values. And there are many reasons for it. I'm not going to go into them now because it's late, but we'll have to pick it up next week. But that's what Judaism says. It's imperative that the body is buried. You come from the dust, and to the dust you will return. And why specifically cremation is forbidden, we'll talk about next week. Let me see if there's anything else. But just one.
Can the shomer be a family member, or it must be somebody other than a family member?
If a family member is sitting Shiva...
No, not the family member sitting Shiva. Let's say a relative.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so you can
Yeah.
be a family member.
Yeah. And even though they don't have to do anything there, it's better that they recite Psalms. The idea is just to be there as a sign of respect for the... Also, in the olden days, it was a protection that rodents shouldn't do anything to the body. But it's more, not just protecting the body, it's also showing respect for the body. And even though the 12 months ends the period of mourning, total period of mourning, it's still a good, desirable thing to visit the grave, at least at the yard site. Any questions? Yes?
Yeah, you said about the teacher, is upset, meaning the teacher's soul is upset for the body, and yet Steinfeld says in Tanya that the soul just wants to get away from the body in the worst way. And the soul just wants to be united with God. Get me away from this physicality.
It's both are true. Both are true. It says in Ethics of the Fathers, it's against your will that you're alive, because your soul doesn't want to come down, and it's against your will that you die, because once it comes down, it recognizes that it can't do things in the next world that it can do here. So the soul has mixed feelings. On one hand, it wants to be free from this world, but on the other hand, it wants to continue. So it is a case of mixed feelings.
What about the soul, a soul who has no loved ones in this world, and the body has no loved ones in this world, and then the body dies, and then the soul is left in the next world? Who does the soul love in the next world? Who does the soul have in the next world?
It has God.
Not gotten anyone in this world.
It has God. And its connection to the Jewish, if it's a Jewish soul, the connection to the Jewish people, the connection is about to everyone.
No one, there's no meeting fresh people like there is in this world.
Yes. There's a passage in the Zohar that says how souls emanate from other souls. That souls are connected, even if they're not physically connected in this world. So there is a concept that souls, you can have soulmates. Actually, it says in the Talmud that when you visit the sick, you take away a little bit of their sickness, 1/60th. So the Talmud says, well, let 60 people come and you'll cure the person. So they say, no, it doesn't work with everyone. It only works with a soulmate. The Talmud uses a term, born in the same mazel, in the same constellation. But what it really means, if your soul is connected to that soul, then you'll take away 1/60th. We don't know whose souls are connected, except by physical connections. But there is such a thing as souls being connected to other souls.